It's on Netflix. As you'll recognize, Oprah Winfrey is in the middle. She stars in it, and she's also been involved in directing. I think you need a firm Christian constitution if you are to watch this series. It is based on a fictitious black majority church in the States. It is exploring themes of morality within this particular church. There's a mixture of pure Christian spirituality. There are issues to do with money, sex, and power. I'm watching it with Neil. It's on Netflix. We're only up to, I think, episode 3, and already there's undisclosed rape. There are issues to do with adultery, issues to do with homosexuality, undoubted issues to do with power abuse. It would be lovely to think that the crossover between the world in terms of money, sex, and power and the kingdom of God doesn't exist. But I think we all know, whether we take this program seriously or not, that there are issues between what happens within us as human beings and our Christian convictions. And however we respond to a series like this, and it is quite a challenging presentation of dualism, Christians living in two places, being one person in the pulpit, one person in a worship setting, quite another person in front of a screen at home, quite another person in terms of what they're doing in bed, quite another person in terms of what they're doing in their social life. That sense of dualism, even if this particular presentation is an exaggeration or unacceptable, frankly still holds true. I trained at Spurgeon's College between 1982 to 86, and I'm going to be discreet in what I say about some of these things, but as a young, passionate Christian man who was quite clear, I felt, about sexual ethics and what God expected of me and others, it was a roller coaster to see that the first church that I was placed in, which is not that far from this building, in my placement in that first year, the minister had an affair with a member of the congregation. His ministry imploded. I was actually going to the manse on a regular basis, meeting with him and his wife, and realizing that actually that this was unraveling in front of me, and I was only slowly picking up on it before it hit the congregation. That was a big reality curve. And then there was a guy who had left our college. He had been a student when I arrived. He talked about, in his ministry, he was what we now call a NAM, a newly accredited minister. He was based in a church in Essex. And he talked about how that women were hitting on him in the congregation. As a married man, he'd found this difficult. Within 6 months of him coming back to talk to us about what it was like in ministry, he had actually had an affair with one of those women, and his marriage had collapsed, and he was out of ministry. And at the same time, in the 4 years I was there, another guy who was a leader of a Baptist church was exposed through the Sun and the news of the world because he was caught in a police swoop on a gay club in Soho, presumably trying to rescue a guy who had a gay lifestyle, who was living in the manse with him and his wife. But there were issues about whether he was there really to support this guy or he'd been drawn into a double life himself. I don't say any of this to shock you. It's just simply to say, if we think that the passions within us will simply and easily be parked by our allegiance to Jesus, we are fooling ourselves. We're fooling ourselves. When I became a Christian some 40 years ago last week in Plymouth, I can still remember going to a youth service in a local Baptist church in Salisbury Road in central Plymouth. And I don't remember very much about what the minister said, but the one thing I do remember him saying was that our sexuality can be like a wild horse. And a wild horse needs to be tamed. A wild horse, if tamed, can take you a long way. But a wild horse which is not tamed will kick and fly around, and you will be severely damaged by its raw, uncontrolled energy. The simple truth is, either you manage your sexuality or your sexuality manages you. And I would simply observe, whether you are a Christian or not, if your sexuality manages you, you will reap the whirlwind. If you cannot control your urges, in particular contexts, you are very liable to do things that will shame yourself and your family and your God. So what we're talking about is a tough reality check. We've been doing a series on the kingdom of God. And as I look through Matthew's gospel, it's very interesting that in the longest section where Jesus talks about marriage, mainly divorce, and sexuality, he does refer to the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, in this particular phrase, particularly because those who are abstaining from an active sexual life, he describes as being eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. When we come to discuss this sort of topic, we don't discuss it in a vacuum. And I want you to notice three things before we come to the main text. First of all, sexuality and the contemporary context. I don't have a degree in psychology, even as the person who's leading the service does. But I will tell you one thing, that I have understood that the major consensus that has grown in the Western world, particularly, I would suggest, fueled by the thinking of Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century, is that we are particularly, or even primarily, or even solely driven by our sexuality. That, I would suggest to you, is the working assumption of the wider Western culture. And I illustrate this with a statue that I saw a week ago. You may not be familiar with this. It's an incredible statue, I would say. It was produced by Bernini in the mid-1600s in a church, San Maria de Vittoria, in the Carrara Chapel. And it illustrates a particular moment of spiritual ecstasy for a character called Saint Teresa of Avila. Saint Teresa was based in the little town of Avila on the outskirts of Madrid, and she is one of these kind of iconic Catholic saints who had such intense experiences of the love of God that she describes them in ecstatic form. And she talks at one point about how an angel pierces her heart with a golden arrow, and the sensation of this and the experience of intense divine love pouring into her spirit practically almost levitates her off her bed. The sheer intensity of this experience. And Bernini very powerfully demonstrates this experience. And although you can't see it so clearly in this photograph, if you look to her face, she is lost, totally lost in an ecstatic moment. And he really presents this in a very graphic and powerful way. The reality is now, if you read comments about both her description of the experience of the arrow, which is sometimes described in almost phallic sense, and the way in which she writhes in this kind of agony of ecstasy demonstrated by this statue, most people see this as being more sexual than religious. In fact, if you Google this particular image, you will see that many people talk about it as a spiritual orgasm.